Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, October 27th, 2021. And on this episode, I've got a follow-up to many episodes I've done, but it's a message that's so important to repeat over and over and over until we really start seeing more and more movement in the right direction for the Constitution and liberty. And I'm talking about partnerships. That is, where the feds partner with the states, and they do this to implement and enforce most federal programs, if not really all, if we're thinking about it statistically. So if one of the partners opts out, then the program is dead in the water. It goes either direction, really. So I've got some insight from some leading founders. We've got Madison and Roger Sherman, of course. I've talked about Theophilus Parsons, but even Alexander Hamilton, who stumbled upon nullification where he didn't really like it, but he understood the process. And then we've got some of the latest news of today to show how this just isn't just theory, but we see it playing out in practice before our very eyes. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. And a quick show programming note, it's possible I won't have a show on Friday. It would maybe be Saturday, or I might skip it. Tomorrow is my 18-year anniversary, so I might take a little bit of time off. We'll just see how that plays out. Anyways, our show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives of this show, all the individual episodes. I include links to stuff that I talk about today. I've got a bunch of different episodes, source documents, articles for you to read, learn, listen more on your own time and context, because I'm just scratching the surface. You can find all the different platforms. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch. But we also live stream at Odyssey.com, decentralized, censorship resistant. Follow us there. It really is an important platform. There's also others that we archive the videos on, Gab TV and Minds and MeWe and BitChute and BitTube and Hyper. And I think we're going to start doing Sovereign Media, which is Ben Swan's new project or updated project. We just got access to upload video there as well. And then, of course, we have the podcast edition, audio only, over at Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, all of those. Even Facebook now carries the podcast. Reviews on Apple Podcasts help out a ton in spreading the word. And then also our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And I sometimes hear people say, you know, they'll sign up for a membership, and a week or so later, I'll finally get to it and say, hey, thank you so much. I'll send an email, and they'll say, you know, my measly $2 or $5 or $10. But I'll tell you, for about 5 years early on, maybe the first 3 to 4 years of running this organization, I was still working a part-time job, getting paid $11 an hour, so I could eat, so I could afford a bus pass, so I could go places and do things, pay for the internet. And for many years, I didn't even have cell phone service. I was just hooking up to Wi-Fi wherever I went to. So a few dollars a month goes a long way. We build on that. That's what our foundation, our motto is based on a phrase, or it is a phrase that John Dickinson used in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767 against the Hated Townsend Acts, where he said, Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. So whether it's every $2 or every small step to chip away against the empire, they grow great when we get more and more and more of them. It's the journey of 1,000 steps. 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Anyways, I'm rambling. Let's say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Good to see a bunch of people here today. I appreciate it. MRGF, Richard Banks, Dixie Strong, Cheriton, Haji mentions this as a follow-up, as well as today's Ron Paul Liberty Report with Daniel McAdams, who I finally got to meet in Virginia recently. Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you. Missouri Liberty Alliance, Missouri in the house. I'm going to mention you guys a little bit later. Clay Kent, Melody Skaman, Joe Vasquez, Leslie, good to see you as well. Murray Ray, Dwayne. Did I say Clay Kent? Always good to see you, and thank you for the congratulations. Michael, Keith the Hat Guy, good to see you, buddy. And everyone else, Life of Tech, and I apologize if I missed anybody, but I'm pretty long into this intro here. Let's get right to this. I want to start out with an article by Mike Meharry, who has been busting his butt. I don't know if you guys, for those of you who know Mike personally, he's had a lot of family issues recently that he's taking care of, and he's really, we got to be very grateful for the work that he's been putting in this week and last, especially, I mean, all the time, of course, for more than a decade now. But the last couple of weeks, he's been really trying to knock out the work on our annual State of the Nullification Movement report so we can have it in at least select people's hands before Thanksgiving or around that time. And it's important to show people, this is like a prospectus. We talk about not only the strategy and the history and the use of nullification, but how it's playing out today. So here's an article that we published by Mike a couple of months ago, and here's how he starts out. This is a talking point we use all the time. During the run-up to the 2013 federal government shutdown, the National Governors, we should put shutdown in scare quotes all the time, because when they shut down, the gun grabbers keep grabbing, the spies keep spying, the warfare state, the empire keeps occupying, the asset forfeiture programs continue, qualified immunity, all the stuff that we don't want to see shut down continues. But then they'll tell old people who they've convinced, they've tricked us all into relying on them for our retirement, for everything, for education, for all the important stuff that's not supposed to be in the hands of the federal government. And they tricked us all into relying on them. And then they say, well, you might not get your grandparents might not get their check. And whether you think the program shouldn't exist like I do or not, you're literally attacking the people who need it the most in order to get the most funding. They don't shut down all the really horrible stuff that is attacking people and killing people and throwing people in cages. They go after the weak all the time, and that's the nature of power. They're horrible, horrible people. So they don't really shut it down, but they call it that. So that 2013 shutdown, National Governors Association made a startling admission. The federal government depends on the states to do pretty much everything it does. He continues. He says, as the government was threatening to, and he put it in quotes there, shut down, the NGA sent a panicked letter, and he links to it, to congressional leadership, begging them to avoid the shutdown. Now, they're almost kind of like Hamilton here, which you'll notice a little bit later, where they're acknowledging that the partnership is fragile, and if someone opts out, it breaks down the entire system. But they don't like that. That's just how Hamilton approached it. In this email, Mike writes, the governors affirmed the feds need the states. Quote, states are partners with the federal government in implementing most federal programs. A lack of certainty at the federal level from a shutdown therefore translates directly into uncertainty and instability at the state level. Or we would just say a shutdown on either end just leads towards more liberty and more constitution. It might be some instability, but an instability of oppression is not a positive thing. And Mike says, did you catch that? Most federal programs, of course, partnerships don't work very well when half the team quits, and that's why James Madison advised this as a strategy in Federalist Paper number 46, which he published in January 29th, 1788. He gave us a 4-step blueprint with how to deal with the federal government, how to stop federal programs without relying on the federal government to magically limit itself. None of his 4 steps included going to the federal government and begging them in their courts or through elections or lawsuits or any of that stuff. It was all on a state, local, and individual level, including this gem, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, Alexander Hamilton, in his own weird way, God, I can't stand that guy. Federalist 28 had a very similar, was it Federalist 28? Yeah, Federalist 28 in December 26, 1787, had a very similar approach. It's kind of wordy, but if you get to the core meaning, he's talking here in this paper about how, the feds might go too far, the states might go too far, and he says the people, by throwing themselves into either scale, will infallibly make it preponderate. Hamilton. If their rights are invaded by either, so either state or federal government, they can make use of the other as the instrument of redress. So to Hamilton, of course, he always wants more centralized power. But so he's saying if the states do a problem, go to the feds and get it shut down. If the feds do something wrong, go to the states and get it shut down. Don't go to the people that created the problem as a solution to the problem that was created. Now, most of the time when the states do something bad today, this should be its own episode. If we follow the money, most of the bad stuff that the states do, whether it's prohibition of plants or self-defense or whatever it may be, everything in between, most of the programs are funded by the feds. So if we follow the money, the source of the problem is almost always the feds and then the states being willing partners. So we need an opt-out of that. Anyways, here's Hamilton again. I shouldn't really quote him as much as I do, but sometimes it's actually good to point out that even the worst of the worst got it right. It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system, wrote Hamilton, that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. So he's saying right here in Federalist 28, even Hamilton is, in essence, kind of a nullifier. He's basically saying they're going to figure out how to do this on a state level, not by getting the people to beg the feds to stop, but when the feds do stuff they're not supposed to, the states will, he didn't use the term resist, but check this out. He says they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. That's Hamilton, Federalist number 28, December 26, 1787. And here from an article that we published a few years ago by Rob Nadelson talking about another kind of a forgotten founder, Theophilus Parsons. He's kind of, I've called him oftentimes kind of the Patrick Henry, a great orator of Massachusetts. He was a Federalist. Patrick Henry obviously was not. But here's how Rob put it. He says, although Hamilton's Federalist number 28 and Madison's Federalist 46 are justly famous for their expositions of how states and individuals should resist federal usurpation, Parsons also was making the same case about the same time. So these guys were not alone. There are many others. Of course, I've covered this in other episodes. But even Rob, who is a kind of a Federalist Society guy, I wouldn't call him a Hamiltonian, but he's good on a lot of issues, and he's been very kind to the 10th Amendment Center for many, many years, to me personally as well. But that doesn't mean we agree on strategy all the time, but he's recognizing that Hamilton and Madison here are saying states and individuals should resist federal usurpation, not go to the federal government to limit the federal government. Here he goes on again. On January 23rd, 1788, this is in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, 3 weeks after publication of Hamilton's Federalist 28, and 6 days before Madison's Federalist 46, Parsons rose in that gathering to point out certain checks and balances inherent in the proposed Constitution. First, he starts with the oath. The oath we forget oftentimes that the people who are in state government also, they not only take an oath to their state constitution, but to the federal constitution. And so it really is their duty, because they are taking an oath, to not participate, to make sure that the state is not participating in unconstitutional federal programs. That is, resisting, opting out, not being a part of it, because even if they can't physically stop the federal government, and I think that would be very difficult at this point, but even if they can't do that, or if it's not a good strategy choice, especially today, they can certainly opt out, and recognizing that their partners, opting out is how you bring them down. That's what Madison told us. Here's Parsons. The oath of several legislative, executive, and judicial officers of the several states take to support the federal Constitution is as effectual a security against the usurpation of the general government as it is against the encroachment of the state governments. He says the people, but sir, the people themselves, even more important than the state governments. And of course, Hamilton was kind of a statist, and he was only talking about this in relationship to state governments. He got into a little bit on individuals, not as much as Madison. But Parsons was very clear on this. He says that the people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation without being driven to an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation is not obligatory. So when the government passes laws that they're not authorized to, you are not bound to obey them. We can trace that tradition of non-compliance and resistance back to Patrick Henry's Virginia resolves against the Stamp Act, John Dickinson, John Hancock's statements and advice against the Stamp Act. If they pass stuff you shouldn't do, you are not bound to obey them. And John Adams even made that legal case against the Stamp Act in 1765 as well. So he says, let him be considered a criminal by the general government, violate the act. But because of a jury trial and jury nullification, he says only his fellow citizens can convict him. They are his jury. And if they pronounce him innocent, not all the powers of Congress can hurt him. So here we go. It's a combination of state, individual, resistance, opting out, and jury nullification to help hammer it home. Now, it wasn't just now, we've often just cited that 2013 National Governors Association to really hammer this home, that even the government is acknowledging this. They don't make it really obvious to everybody, but we really try to put that out there. But now there's even more research on this. In 2021, just this year, a few months ago, a Pew Research Foundation report. Now, again, they're very Hamiltonian. They complain. They're in essence pointing these things out, but they don't like it. They want the government, the centralized power, to be more centralized than the largest government in the history of the world. That's what these people always want. So here Mike writes, a Pew Research Foundation report on surface transportation funding reiterated this important point that the National Governors Association made 8 years ago. The paper is the first in a series of Fiscal Federalism in Action. In the About This Report section, the authors make the same admission as the National Governors Association made 8 years ago. Quote, this is from Pew Research. The federal government and the states are partners in almost every major domestic policy area. And I think that's actually even an understatement, but they've got some research on this. Together, they write, their dollars pay for health care, education, transportation, public safety, and many other programs important to the American public. Now, Pew actually does good research, but they're certainly slanted to a far more progressive view of society, a more Hamiltonian view of centralized power than we are. And that's really the understatement of the year. But they do detailed research. And when they get numbers out there, they're usually pretty solid. Of course, you can use numbers to back up whatever you want. Maybe I do that as well with Federalist 46, for example. But they're pointing out that, like, all of these things, whether it's healthcare, education, transportation, public safety, all this stuff is a partnership. So if one side pulls out or one side isn't throwing enough dollars at it, and of course I think that's really what they want is more money at these government programs, then the whole thing falls apart. The goals can't be accomplished. We see that as a good thing, and that should be a green light to withdraw from as many as possible. Mike writes, this has significant ramifications. The federal government depends on teamwork to get virtually anything done. And what happens if half the team quits? Well, things don't get done. And that's exactly what Roger Sherman said. This is should be one of the most famous founding fathers. He's the only person to have signed the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution for the United States. Pretty important dude. But here's how he put it in December of 1787, weeks before Hamilton's Federalist 28. He says, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. So it's important to understand that in principle and in theory, as soon as they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, it's void, and we have to treat it that way. That's exactly what James Otis said back in 1761, which John Adams, this is his arguments against the writs of assistance, which John Adams called the beginning of the controversy between the colonies, the people of America, and Great Britain. And he argued there, acts against the Constitution are void. Now, I haven't found an earlier version of that. There probably is from something that the founding generation learned from. But James Otis Jr., even against the unwritten Constitution, recognized that sovereignty was somewhere other than in government. In the past, they would recognize that if governments did something, and then you put some stuff on paper, and then government decided to change its mind and apply those words on paper the way it wanted to, then government is sovereign. Government has final authority. But if the people treat themselves as having final authority, they can look to the document and say, well, you're only authorized to do this, and you don't have final say over what it means. We do. And so therefore, screw it. We don't have to participate. An act against the Constitution is void. Roger Sherman saying the exact same thing, but it doesn't just get void. I mean, you can't just wave words on paper at the largest government in history of the world and say, follow this, guys. Here's what it says. So many people over the years, every time we talk about something about commerce or general welfare or anything in the Constitution, they'll be like, you should send this article or this video to Congress. Why? They don't care. All they care about is what they can get away with. They don't care whether the founders said they can't do this. They do what they're going to get away with no matter what the paper happens to say. What's more important is that people understand the limits of the Constitution. They understand the advantages of liberty, and then they understand how to defend all of it. That's what Samuel Adams said in his great Boston Gazette letter of October 14th, 1771. It's off the top of my head. He said, basically, all might be free if they A, valued freedom, and B, defended it as they ought. I added the A, B there. Anyway, so back to Roger Sherman. He's saying all acts of Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. But they don't get void in practice. He says, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. That's just what National Governors Association is saying. That's what Madison said the following month. That's what Hamilton said. That's what they're all telling us all along. Pew Research is saying this year. He goes on. Sherman says when it overleaps those bounds of the Constitution and interferes with the rights of the state governments, they will be powerful enough to check that. Now, this isn't just theory. We see it playing out in practice, and part of the reason I'm going through this is because we're wrapping up our 2021 annual State of the Nullification Movement report, which I think is going to be the best one ever. We did a total rewrite of the first section. If you've read this, it's a 108-page free ebook that we have available for Kindle, PDF, Apple Books. We make it available at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Last year's is still there, and it's got a lot of great info, but we've really updated the strategy and history going further back into the Revolutionary Era principles that build the foundation for resistance and nullification at the time of the Constitution in 1798 and today. And then we also see how it's playing out in practice on various issues. And I think the granddaddy of the modern nullification movement not started, but really kind of picked up in 1996 with passage of Prop 215, which legalized cannabis here in California for limited medical purposes. And of course, we've seen how that has grown. My puns are intended. Now, 36 states are basically the people, millions and millions of people are saying, well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter that the federal government at all levels says this product is illegal. This naturally occurring plant is illegal. It doesn't matter that the Supreme Court said in 2005 that if you grow it in your backyard, you consume it in your home, you never buy or sell it or take it across state lines. It doesn't matter that the Supreme Court ruled against the people there and said this is somehow interstate commerce. People are doing it anyways. They don't want us doing this, but we're doing it anyways. And we can apply it to a bunch of other stuff. But we're now seeing some studies, some official research studies, reaffirming what we've been saying for many, many years, that this state-level opt-out, when enough people say no to the federal government and do what they want, do what's best for them, make their own choices, whether I agree with their choice or not, when enough people say no to the federal government and enough states or localities pass laws to help back them up, even in the smallest ways, there's not much the feds can do to shove their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats. Hear from Kyle Yeager over at marijuanamoment.net just 2 weeks ago. He writes, state-level marijuana legalization has left the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, one of those many, many agencies like the ATF, which never should have existed in the first place, with far fewer samples of seized illicit cannabis to analyze. A study led by top marijuana investigator for the federal government. So there's an investigator for the federal government who's looking at how this plays out over time. And now all of a sudden they have way less seized product. They can't seize as much. Why? Seizures have, quote, precipitously, man, I can't say that word. I can read it, declined over time, starting in the year 2011. So California was 1996, and we saw this pick up. And then the government became less and less capable around the time that there was, I guess there was probably about 14 or 15 states. I'm just guessing off the top of my head, maybe 16 states at that time. So maybe that's the point we need to get to, 16 or so states where the feds all of a sudden start losing their ability to do the enforcement at the levels that they want. So really started declining really aggressively, instead of the other word that I can't read. Starting in 2011 to 2019, it went from 2,300 exhibits to less than 100. So 2,342 in 2011 down to less than 100 in 2019. That's a significant drop, and that's because there just isn't much enforcement happening. The study, published in the Journal of Biological Psychiatry earlier this year, says, quote, this is possibly the result of legalization of cannabis for medical or recreational use in many states that has curtailed DEA enforcement efforts. And we don't see states or localities going to arrest DEA agents. It's literally just a hands-off approach. They don't have the resources or the person power to get this done. And it's far more difficult on the right to keep and bear arms when it comes to the feds, which I'll get to briefly in just a moment. And here's another article published earlier this year in June, again by Kyle over at mm.net. In an updated facts sheet, the U.S. Sentencing Commission, USSC, which is an independent agency in the judicial branch of the federal government, analyzed the number of drug trafficking convictions and found there were 1,118 cases for cannabis in 2020. That's down 67% since 2016, shortly after the first recreational markets started to mature. So that's also going down significantly. You legalize what the federal government permits, whether it's a behavior, a choice, whatever. You stop enforcing for the federal government to some degree. Now, in many of these states, they still do help the feds, but they just don't help nearly as much anymore. And then the federal enforcement apparatus breaks down completely. And there's a nice chart here that covers this, and one more on cannabis here from Normal. According to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, police made 546,602 arrests for marijuana-related violations in 2019. I mean, that's a lot still. It's actually more than all other violent crime. I think it's like, here it is. The total is 9% higher than the total number of persons arrested for the commission of violent crimes, 495,000. To put that in perspective, if they're putting more resources towards a plant than they are towards violent crime, that's a real issue. It should be in practice too. It doesn't even matter for the many people who don't even think about the constitutional ramifications. That is a serious problem there. Anyways, 545,000. The reason I chose 2019 rather than 2020, which went down even further to 345, pretty significant. It's possible that that was an anomaly due to, well, all the garbage of the last year that government is putting us through, and it's still to this day. And now we're seeing all the shortages in labor and product and all kinds of stuff because of government causing all the problems. Anyways, the significant point here is in 2019, 545,000. Overall, they write, these arrests are down significantly from their peak a decade ago when police made over 800,000 marijuana-related arrests annually. The peak was during the reign of King Obama. And of course, he was supposed to be the one who was the best on this, and he was the worst in history, just like his follow-up guy was supposed to be the best in history on the right to keep and bear arms and did the most federal enforcement on that. All of this stuff is totally topsy-turvy, upside down. So legalizing on a state level, once you get to 14, 15, maybe a dozen states, probably less than that, you start seeing their ability to increase enforcement break down, and then to even sustain it break down much quicker. And then as you keep ramping up, small things grow great by concord. Now, it's not just weed, it's happening finally. We've been pushing for a long time on this. We're starting to see it happen, and thank you to the great people in Missouri. I saw Missouri Liberty Alliance, Liberty Revolutionary, of course, Ron Calzone, Dave Rowland, and so many other great people in Missouri who have been working on this, whether some people for just a few, 6-8 months or a year, other people for 8 years straight, to opt the state out, to ban the state from participating in the enforcement of a large swath. Not everything, but a large swath of federal gun control measures, all of which shouldn't exist. They should get to all of them all the time and then follow up by repealing all the state-level gun control, but one step at a time. So we see a huge effort in Missouri with the Second Amendment Preservation Act passing, and then a more narrowly defined similar piece of legislation in Arizona. So these are the two big ones. There's been other efforts that are smaller, for example, in Montana and elsewhere, and in Texas, they're taking this approach just on sound suppressors. They've basically grandstanded and pretended they did a broader one, but that one's garbage. But their piece of legislation to ban enforcement on sound suppressors is a positive step forward. Now, it's really up to the people in these states to start exercising their rights, despite the fact that the federal government says it's illegal to do so. And that's so important. Without that resistance, the federal government never has any government, federal, local, state, whatever. No government has any reason to keep itself in check if people allow it to get out of check. So I did a whole episode covering these efforts on the right to keep and bear arms, using the 10th Amendment to defend the Second, a brief history. It is me talking, me version of brief, is probably, I don't know, what is it, 43 minutes. It's important stuff to learn where this came from, the ups and downs and the pitfalls that we've seen faced over these years. It really got going in 2004. I will link to that in the show notes. I hope you'll check that episode out. And then more recently, we're starting to see things happen on the right to keep and bear arms, dealing with federal gun control. Really, really good things. Can we see a similar approach that we've seen on cannabis, on the right to keep and bear arms, on surveillance, on the police state and other issues that the federal government is getting itself involved in stuff and having states opt out instead? Can we see that happen on the new OSHA mandates? I don't know, but I did an episode on that talking about how OSHA does not have many resources. And in fact, that has been a long time complaint by people at OSHA. They have about 2,000 enforcement agents for the entire country. 1,200 of them, more than 1,200, work for the states. 774 or 73, whatever the number is, work for the federal government. So the states, and with that resources, combined state and federal, OSHA's told us for many years it would take them 160 years to investigate, to check out every business under its jurisdiction just one time. So it's absolutely impossible for them to keep a lid on their types of regulations and control if people and businesses in large numbers refuse to participate. And then if states opt out and kick the can back to the feds, man, that is a whole nother step forward. So I will link to this. This is actually on the audio end. This actually might be my most listened to podcast ever. Can states nullify the new federal mandates? That was in September of this year. I will link to it in the show notes as well. But back to Meharry. He points out that Alexander Hamilton also stumbled onto this truth in Federalist number 16. He argued that the states should not have any say in executing the powers of the federal government. Why? Because he wanted the federal government to be as supreme as possible. We know that just a few years later, of course, he made the argument for all kinds of implied powers that he said weren't within the purview of federal power during ratification. So he didn't like the idea that the feds might rely on the states. Other people like Sherman and Madison were selling it as a positive to ratifiers, encouraging them to ratify based on this. Hamilton was as well, but I think he was a scammer. Anyways, he argued that states should not have any say in executing the powers of the federal government. In doing so, he unwittingly laid the foundation of state nullification. Quote, and this is Hamilton, Federalist 16, "If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated." Man, that's what we need to remember over and over and over. They only have to not act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. And at the end of the day, going to the federal government to fix problems by the federal government that were created by the federal government isn't just bad strategy. It doesn't work. It never has worked. It wasn't supposed to work. That's not the way we were supposed to do things. It's also been very dangerous to the Constitution and all of our liberty. The way forward really is to resist, refuse to comply, and nullify. I'm going to take a quick look over in the live chat. Leslie says, happy anniversary, Bolden, and your beautiful partner, Sarah. She's amazing. Keith, the hat guy, you're right. The quitting team can be the winner in this case. It's how you define winner. Hamilton would always want centralized power. Pew Research, National Governors Association, the winner is whoever gets to implement the most power and have the most money and control over everyone's lives. For us who love liberty, it's the winner are those who quit. Absolutely, the quitter is the winner. Norman Freedom says, what specific action steps can we individuals do today? Ooh, that's a huge question. That's probably covered in at least 10 different episodes. First thing that I would recommend is getting yourself, Norman, very familiar with the background and the strategy of how this plays out. We also can explain to you the legal basis, the Supreme Court opinions that actually even back this up, and then see how it plays out on various issues. That's over at our annual State of the Nullification Movement report. You can read it for free. You don't have to give your name, nothing. We're not asking for any info. Just go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Even though the new version isn't updated yet, you'll still learn quite a bit there. And maybe one of the issues that we cover in the second half of how it's being played out is something that's important to you. If not, try to look and see. I mean, you'll see what people have been doing, whether it's on civil asset forfeiture, federal forfeiture programs. If the states opt out, then the feds don't have a program. Same with federal gun control. States opt out, then there is no federal gun control program. Same with OSHA, whatever, cannabis prohibition. Doesn't matter what the issue is. We have to first pick an issue that's important to you, then look and see how it's enforced, and then work on not only educating people in your area to get your local or state government to opt out of that program, but then also work to get people to exercise their rights without first getting permission. That's an awesome question, Norman, and I'm sorry to be so long on that, but it's a big one. Missouri Liberty Alliances, be sure to give you this video a thumbs up. Really grateful for that. Thank you. Same for Richard Banks. Ryan Lopez, my great friend. You know, it's amazing. You know, we don't live too far from each other here in Southern California. Not that I'm doxing you, buddy, but, you know, we were both in Orlando for the Tom Woods event just recently, and I saw the back of your head at one point, and I'm like, man, I got to go run over and say hi. And then I think someone grabbed me to go do something. Anyways, I missed giving you a hug and saying hello, but I appreciate you stopping by and saying hi here, Ryan. Oh, here's an interesting point that Ryan makes as well. They say it takes 10.1% of the population to believe in an idea before it becomes accepted as truth by the majority. I haven't seen a study on that, but I've seen people talk about how, you know, it was like 3% were in support of the revolution. So that's, you know, the 3%er idea. Tim Taylor says government is like the blob. Yeah, this is the power expands, power corrupts, and power always grows message that is just so prevalent throughout the founding generation, whether it's John Adams or Abigail Adams or Samuel Adams, who said, and I don't think it was a pun, but he said, power is intoxicating. And men legally vested it with always try to get more, right? And here's what Tim Taylor says. A government is like the blob. The more it eats, the bigger it gets. The bigger it gets, the more it eats. Dwayne Ellsbury is right. I hate the saying legalize it and tax the hell out of it. Yes, I absolutely agree. The tax and regulate approach is actually, it's not the end game. We have to look at each step as a step forward. Salt Laker says there's always been a shortage of common sense. Yes. And maybe we all need to read Payne's Common Sense a little bit more as well. But Dwayne, you're absolutely right on that. I think that's an important point. So when we're talking about these legalization efforts, and I covered this in an episode as well called Nullification, Part 1, something like that, the history of the cannabis efforts going all the way back to 1970, we're actually starting to see some opposition to the taxing schemes on these plants. They're actually, I just saw a publication in the last couple of weeks pointing out how the gray market, the illegal market, is actually twice the size of the legal market. And even in a mainstream publication that would absolutely hate everything we do was pointing out that the high taxes and the regulation is causing the legal market to struggle, and people are going to the free market. Really, we should call it the free market. They didn't put it that way, but that's an important point. And I think some people are seeing that play out in practice, and hopefully we'll get some positive things. Let's see what else. Clay Kent, Hamilton was a Tyrannosaurus jackass. Awesome as usual. Thank you. Norman says, thank you for answering. I appreciate your question. It's a big one, and I'm sorry I don't have a lot more detail, but I think that will, especially if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, that will get you in the right direction. And send us an email. We're 2 to 3 weeks slow on answering emails. GTA2SW City says, I actually didn't mind Missouri when I've gone out there. It's a beautiful place. It's absolutely beautiful place. I love it there. My partner, Sarah, grew up there. Been a long time since I've been. Anyways, I apologize that I'm rambling at this point. I'm really grateful for you spending some time with me today. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We absolutely need your financial support if you're able to. No pressure, but a little pressure. It starts out as little as $2 a month. We make your support go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And of course, if whether you can do that or not, make sure to smash the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, get notification, comments in the archives, all that stuff, especially the mainstream platforms, trigger the algorithm and tell the platform to show the program to more people. I really appreciate your help in spreading the word. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time, Friday, maybe, otherwise next week, Monday, here on the path to liberty.